Hello and welcome to the Bible Standard. Part 5 now of our Nehemiah series, Consistency, Don't Be Distracted, Be Impacted. In this expositional deep dive Bible study, we explore Nehemiah chapters 5 and 6 and uncover timeless lessons on steadfastness in a turbulent world. Discover how Nehemiah confronted internal crises, famine, debt and exploitation while resisting external threats and distractions. His unwavering consistency offers a thought-provoking blueprint for spiritual renewal, urging us to build walls of faith amid chaos. Learn to address sin with courage, lean on God in prayer, and invest wholeheartedly in God's work. A wonderful study for those seeking depth in faithfulness. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and drop us a comment with your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.
The key for all of us is consistency and faithfulness and steadfastness. And that's our theme for this evening as we look at this amazing example of Nehemiah and his ability to exhort and provide a wonderful example of consistency to the people around as they worked on the wall. Well, if you remember last Wednesday, we had a look at chapter 4. We're going to look at chapter 5 and 6 this evening. But you'll remember that there was an acceleration of problems for Nehemiah. There was internal weariness. The workers were beginning to say, look, it's too much. There's too much rubble here. We can't construct the wall. But Nehemiah encouraged them to face up to those physical threats. And of course, the last verse of chapter 4 talks about a spade in one hand and a spear in the other. And so they had to not only work, but protect themselves. But now there's a new challenge, and the thing that I find quite amazing about Nehemiah is that every time we turn a page, there's a new challenge. And Nehemiah faces it, he resolves it, and the work moves on. And that is just an amazing example. So there's quite a number of factors now that open up in chapter 5, and there were problems beyond the wall. You'll notice in verse 2, there's a food shortage. Talks about they're taking up corn because there's a food shortage. There's a famine as well, obviously an extension in verse 3. End of verse 3 says because of the dearth. There's exorbitant interest rates in verse 4, and there's slavery in verse 5. So I've got coloured in red in verse 2, corn, in verse 3, dearth, in verse 4, tribute, in verse 5, bondage. Because these are problems that are sort of rippling out, and the people are absolutely desperate. And you'll notice it's not only the builders now that are complaining. If you have a look in verse 1, it talks about the wives of the brethren. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say the wives led the rebellion, but probably in fairness to them, their husbands have left all their normal trades, and the conditions on the domestic scene were quite difficult. They'd been working for 2 months, almost 2 months now, on the walls, most of these brethren. So obviously it was going to be a very difficult time. And when we have a look at the time period, we notice here, and Nehemiah records through his diary certain chronological events, and we know here that he started when the first grapes were being harvested, because chapter 6 and verse 15 actually puts the calendar in there and how long it took. So this is when the walls were completed, and we work back 52 days, so that's when it started. So you'll notice here in the calendar of Israel, it's a very agricultural and productive time. There's grapes, they're tending to the grapes, harvesting, they're harvesting all the summer fruits. There's the olive harvest here, and they're around the corner from starting to plough the field. So, you know, if you're a farmer or if you're an orchardist, this is a critical time for you, and you've been labouring on the wall for a couple of months. And so now there's, in verse 1, there's a great cry, says the verse, and the Hebrew word is saga, and it basically means a shriek or an anguished outburst. It's quite strong. It's the same word used in Exodus 3 and verse 7 and 9, where God says, I've heard their cry. This is the people of Israel as they staggered under the oppression of the Egyptian taskmasters. Now, they were quite brutal, the Egyptian taskmasters, and the whole nation back then in Exodus 3, verse 7 and 9, it's that word cry. It's the people of Israel crying out to God for relief. So this isn't just, some sort of minor complaint. The whole nation now feels the pressure, the resources have been directed to the wall, and now the families are suffering. So it was going to be a very difficult, stressful time for those people that are committed to the walls and their families. In fact, there's no mention of the work on the walls in chapter 5 for 15 verses. The people basically threw down their tools, and verse 2 is saying, the New Revised Standard says, we've got to get grain so that we can eat and stay alive. So this is the rendition of the NRV. We've got to get grain so we can eat and stay alive. So this is quite desperate times. And verse 3 goes on. There were some that were quite frantic because obviously the grain price went up. It's been inflated, so the cost of food is up. In verse 4, as we've said, there's taxation they've got to afford as well. And in fact, the point gets in verse 5 that they were having to sell themselves as slaves so that they could recover from the debt that they'd incurred. In fact, if you notice in verse 11, Nehemiah asks for the leaders of the nation, the people in the finance area, to restore the people to their fields. And it says there also the 100th part of the money that you exact. Some commentators say that equates 1% per month, multiplied by 12. Basically, it was a 12% interest rate that they were being charged. Now, that seems... I think the Reserve Bank has just dropped the interest rate here in Australia, so we're all cheering. But when we were first married, it was around 12 to 15%. And I know as a young married person that was quite significant. So these people were at similar times. The interest rate was particularly high. They'd all maxed out their credit cards. There's nowhere else to go. The fact is, what they were saying is, building the wall is costing us money. It's costing us our livelihood. And the question they're asking Nehemiah is, can we leave all our fields because the work of the truth is costing us and we can't fund it any longer? I think probably just, looking at those opening verses, we've got to ask the question, why did God cause a famine at this particular time? Because it talks about the end of verse 3, a dearth. So there's a famine going through the land, and you'd be thinking, like, Nehemiah is trying his hardest to build these walls. Why would God allow a famine to occur at a critical moment? And I think for ourselves, it's a good point to step back and think, we can't always fathom the wisdom of God in the situation that we're in. I'm sure we're questioning at times, what is God doing? But of course, in his providential insight, he knows what the outcome is. And what was happening here was there was something occurring behind the scenes that needed correction. So that famine came on. It accelerated the process. Nehemiah addressed it because there were some brethren that were behaving in a mischievous way and overcharging, the general citizen of Israel who were struggling to support the work of the truth. So there was a situation that had to be addressed, and that's why a famine was initiated, and Nehemiah did address it. So here's the breakdown for the chapter, verses 1 to 5. There's exposure to the workers' financial problems. It was costing them to build in the truth. And they were sort of saying, we can't practically support this and continue it. Verse 6 to 10, Nehemiah does an examination of the nobles' motives. They were overcharging the people, and he had to correct the situation. In verse 11 to 13, he gives an exhortation to them. He provides his own personal example. He was not overcharging people. In fact, Nehemiah said, it's costing me as well. And then finally he gives an expression of thankfulness to his God in a prayer of appreciation at the end of chapter 5. I'm just staggered at the pressure that Nehemiah functioned under. As I say, every time I turn a page, there's a new set of problems, and he just seemed to deal with them. And maybe we need to take that attitude on board. We tend to throw our hands up when we get issues or problems. It's too hard, I'll sort it out next year or the year after. But Nehemiah, will notice, addresses it straight away and provides an opportunity for the people to once again continue the work on the wall. So Nehemiah didn't just dismiss this and say, well, we've got to get this wall up, we'll sort that out later on. He didn't say that their problems were unimportant. He didn't adjourn it and put it to one side. He responded immediately to the issue. And the point is, he was trying to build spiritual walls, right? His whole process was not just to get some bricks and mortar up and say, well, my job's done. That was part of it, but the real part that Nehemiah wanted to build was the spiritual walls within the people, so they trusted in their God, whatever were the circumstances. So there's 4 key actions in verse 6 to 13, and we'll unpack those. First of all, we'll notice there he considered the matter. You'll notice he was quite angry there in verse 6. He considered, he gave a balanced response. Secondly, he arranged a public forum to discuss it all. Thirdly, he gave evidence of the issue and asked the nobles to address the issue. And fourthly, he made them publicly commit to the reformation of providing support for those that were working on the wall. So he addressed it immediately. And again, for ourselves as a personal exhortation, is how often do we put issues or behaviour or attitudes or things we need to address to one side, and then they inflame and they get bigger and bigger. We notice as well Nehemiah was an emotional person. We might just think he's a mechanical robot, he's just doing things, he's an administrator, he wants the wall to get up. No. When you look at verse 6, it says he was very angry. Hebrew word kara means to glow with indignation, to burn, or to blaze up, or to be incensed. So it's the same word that's used back in chapter 4, verse 1 and 7, when Sanballat was angry when he saw these walls going up. So it's now mirrored, I guess, in some way in Nehemiah's life. So it does show us that Nehemiah was not just a mechanical engineer that wanted a physical outcome to what he was trying to achieve. He was a very, very emotional person. In fact, we won't get to chapter 13, obviously, because I only got one more study. But in chapter 13, right through chapter 13, the last chapter, I'll give you some emotional content of Nehemiah. He says, it grieved me sore. He says, I cast out the household stuff of Tobiah. I contended with him. I chased him. I smote some of them. I pulled out their hair. So, he wasn't sort of a reticent person when it came to showing his feelings and what he felt. So in our own lives, of course, sometimes we bottle things up. There are certain things that we need to address and we don't, so we bottle it all up and it just gets bigger and then, release. But the beautiful thing about Nehemiah is he had that emotion. He was quite angry. But look at this beautiful phrase, and I've got this coloured in my Bible in verse 7. I consulted with myself. Maybe I sort of need that phrase to help me through, challenging times as well. Consulted with myself. NEB says, I mastered my feelings. And that word consult actually means to give advice or to counsel. We notice there's a marginal, if you've got a King James, very small type. My heart consulted in me. So what he's saying is, I pondered the matter. I exercised myself in reflecting on it. So, he didn't just sort of explode in anger to the people about him uncontrollably. He was quite cross that this situation had arisen, but he mastered those feelings. You might like to put in your margin Proverbs 14:29. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but a person that is hasty of spirit exalts folly. Proverbs 14:29. So Nehemiah pondered this situation as a great exhort for us when we sort of sometimes are reactive to what we hear and what we think should be done. So here's Proverbs 15:28, and we've almost got that same reflection. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer. So for all of us, when we get into a situation where we feel angry, we need to ponder and give time to what our response is going to be. Psalm 4 and verse 4 and 5 says, and this is quoted in Ephesians as well, stand in awe. I think the Hebrew means quiver in anger, but don't sin. Commune with your own heart upon your bed. Think it through carefully. Psalm 77, I call to my remembrance, I commune with my own heart. It's sort of really our conscience kicking in, and we're having a discussion with ourselves as to what would be the appropriate response. And again, for David, 1 Samuel 30, remember at Ziklag, all his friends and supporters around him were going to stone him. He was desperate, but of course he encouraged himself in Yahweh. He pondered through that situation. So Nehemiah does that, and again, James 1 verse 19 and 20, worthwhile putting in the margin, James 1, 19 and 20, that every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man doesn't work the righteousness of God. So he was certainly moved by this situation, but he reflected on it and pondered what was the best pathway to bind the people together in unity and oneness. And so there's a process that he goes on. There's obviously consternation. We've talked about that. There's consultation as he communes with his own heart. He confronts the nobles who had raised up the interest rate. He provides some very sound guidance and counsel for them. He asks for their consideration. He makes a public statement that this situation is going to be resolved, and then there was a commitment to change. So, very sequential, you might say. I guess as a wall builder, they're used to putting bricks in place and building it up, and almost seems as though Nehemiah has overtures of that as he works through this situation. So the first thing he does, we notice in verse 7, is he rebuked the nobles. Now, these were the elders of the ecclesia, we might say, and wouldn't have been an easy task to rebuke these powerful people. But of course, as brothers and sisters, there are times when we've got to give some tough advice. Tough love, isn't it, it's called? And Nehemiah had to approach these respected nobles and tell them that what they were doing was not right. Leviticus 19 verse 17 says, "You will not hate your brother in your heart. You shall in any wise rebuke him and not suffer sin." It's always a really interesting quote. It's Leviticus 19 verse 17. It says, by not giving practical and proper advice to a brother when they're going down a wrong pathway, that equates in God's viewpoint a hatred of your brother. It's quite interesting, isn't it? It's almost God is saying, I will not stand for an apathetic attitude to your brothers and sisters if they are behaving themselves in a wrong way. You need to talk to them. You might even have to rebuke them, and God says that's the definition of love. So this is what Nehemiah is doing. And we notice there that at the end of verse 7 it says, I set a great assembly against them. That doesn't mean he created a rebellion and they're going to stone them. It just simply means he called a public meeting. So Nehemiah was the king's representative, but of course he was part of the community, and he wasn't just like a Donald Trump, like an authoritative person who's going to say, this is how we're going to fix it, and I'm going to fix it by this date. He drew the public assembly together to make them accountable to the community. And again, that's an important thing. And so he says in verse 8, and here's another translation of verse 8, the rest of us are doing all we can to redeem our brethren who have had to sell themselves to pagan foreigners, but you're selling them back into slavery again. How often do we have to redeem them? So, of course, the nation, their history, they've been taken captives into slavery so many times, and Nehemiah is saying the point of the walls, the point of the return back to Jerusalem is freedom to worship God, and you're creating slaves again out of your brothers and sisters. So he was criticising the attitude of those brethren that were overcharging on the financial position of the people working on the wall. Now, little colouring in exercise, because this is quite wonderful. Nehemiah's language, it's not pointing a finger and say, you guys need to think about what you're doing. He uses this term brethren right through. And I find it a very unifying aspect, isn't it, when we recognise that we're all in the same position. There's no fingers being pointed. They've done wrong, but he draws them together as brethren. And that's, I think, an important aspect in the way that we deal with our brothers and sisters. Paul talks about in Ephesians, we have to speak the truth and we have to do it in love. So there's a certain way we need, with respect, to address our brothers and sisters when we're trying to have a better outcome or give them some direction in life. And that language is actually drawn from Deuteronomy chapter 15. Deuteronomy chapter 15 talks about slavery and it talks about release as well. So you'll notice here Nehemiah is actually drawing from the law, and this said, if there be among you a poor man, one of thy brethren within any of thy gates, it's almost terminology of Nehemiah's times, you will not harden your heart nor shut your hand from your poor brother, and if he cries unto you against thee, it's a sin. So what Nehemiah is saying is that they've raised the interest rates. They're putting a lot of pressure on their brethren, and it's against the law of Moses, the principles of the law of Moses. And of course, this translates into the New Testament and into our lives as well, isn't it? Paul uses that in his letter to the Corinthians, where there was disunity and fragmentation. James uses it as well, and the Apostle John uses that phrase, brethren, in bringing us together as a community. So Nehemiah is using appropriate language to address what could have been a situation that got right out of control. And he brings the brothers back together again to have a right consideration for each other. So he makes, of course, a very lovely appeal. He appeals to their consciences. He appeals to their love. Are you going to sell your brothers and put them under this hardship? The appeal to morality. This is not a good thing that you're trying to achieve. The appeal to godliness. Is this how we want to appear in our walk before our God, to be oppressive to our brothers and sisters? He cites Leviticus 25 that we work in a respect of God, and so we need to treat each other with that respect. He talks about the environment, the Gentiles are watching us, and the appeal of example. He uses his own example and commitment to be practical and restore them their lands. Let's get this resolved and let's move through that and continue the work. So that's why he says in verse 9, aren't you afraid of what God thinks? See that in verse 9? Also I said, it's not good what you do. Ought you not to walk, and here it is, in the fear of our God? The fear of Yahweh. So, as I say, he's drawing from Leviticus chapter 29. I'll give you the quote. Leviticus 25 verse 17, 36 and 43. And it says there, you will not take interest or usury of your brother, but you will fear your God that your brother may live with thee. You will not rule over him with rigour, but you will fear your God. And that's exactly what Nehemiah is bringing forward, that law from Leviticus 25, verse 17, 36 and 43. Now look at Nehemiah's language in verse 10. Now I love this point about Nehemiah. He's so inclusive. He says, I. No pointing a finger, you. It's like I, likewise, and my brethren and my servants might exact of them money and corn. I could do this, I pray you. Let us leave off this interest. He wasn't charging anyone around him, but he sort of includes himself as a bit like Daniel's prayer in Daniel chapter 9, when Daniel prays for the sins of the nation. Well, look through Daniel and never find any statement of misbehaviour as far as Daniel is concerned in the whole book. But in his prayer, he includes himself, and this is the essence of Nehemiah as well. And so he encourages them, he calls upon the law, he calls upon their position before their God, he includes himself in that. And then in verse 11 he says, we want this resolved, and we want it resolved today. See that? Verse 11, restore, I pray you, to them. Doesn't just go their lands like some sort of nebulous, well, maybe sometime in the future. He says, even this day. We've got to do it, and you need to make a commitment right here and right now. It's sort of a bit like a Sunday morning memorial, isn't it? We come before the emblems, and it's recommitment that day, that hopefully during the week our walk will be appropriate before our God. So I always think, the little acronym SINS, is helpful. So this is what Nehemiah does. When it comes to sin, we've got to be specific. We like to put nebulous terms out. I'm sorry I've disobeyed you, Heavenly Father, sort of all very vague. Nehemiah identified it. It was wrong in God's sight. He called upon the law. And of course, there's a couple of quotations there that talk about behaviour that's not addressed. So specifically identify it. Then he immediately corrects the situation. He says, even do this today. And again, exhortation to us, we rationalise our behaviour and say, well, I didn't think it was that bad, and sort of on it goes, and then it develops into a habit. So we've got to immediately correct it. And again, quotation there, as far as the Lord Jesus Christ was concerned, he said, if you've got a problem, pluck out your eyes and throw it away. Do it, and do it immediately. The end for nominate or be accountable to others. You'll notice Nehemiah calls the priests in verse 12 to witness the commitment of the people. So we have to be accountable to others, and that adds some reinforcement to a new direction for us to take. And then finally, sins with a final S, seriously commit to God. Verse 13, he reminds them that if you don't release the pressure from these brethren, that you're overcharging them, then of course God will also release you. He'll shake you away from his presence. So he deals with that consistently, steadfastly, and he deals with it immediately. And we need to think about that as well. Have we got problems in our own lives that we're sort of struggling with? Maybe we need to have the faith and the courage to deal with them. And that can be in, any relationship. Might be at work, it could be at uni, it could even be in domestic scene, husband, wife, family, kids. We need to address those issues and try to correct our behaviour before it gets uncontrollable. So in verse 14, then to the end of the chapter, verse 14 to 19, Nehemiah shows his own personal example. And he marks out, and this is obviously a diary entry in verse 14 that is written a little after, because it talks about this whole 12-year period, verse 14, a 12-year period that he was there as overseer or king's representative. And in the 12 years that he served there, you'll notice there in verse 15, at the end of verse 15, he says, I did this because of the fear of God. All right, he wasn't fearful of the people or the nobles or popular opinion or whatever. The end of verse 15, my reverence for God. This is why I'm working in the truth. This is why I love my brothers and sisters, because I have a respect for God. End of verse 15, because of the fear of God. And then you'll notice, as well as that, at the end of verse 18, there's another statement, because the bondage was heavy upon the people, he had compassion for others. So there's two things, two becauses. The reason why he was building that wall and bringing his brethren together is, one, because of his respect for God, verse 15, and two, because of his compassion for others, verse 18. And when you put those two phrases together, remember there was someone that asked Jesus what was the greatest commandment in the Bible? And he said it's to love God and to treat your neighbour with that same love. And here's Nehemiah. There's those exact two principles right there in verse 15 and verse 18. So Nehemiah was doing it for that cause. It wasn't that he wanted to be popular with the people. It was because he loved his God. And he knew that God would hold him accountable for that. Now, I'm staggered at the investment Nehemiah made in this project. When you look at verse 18, he's going to say, look, I've never charged anybody for what I could have charged. And he said, as the king's representatives, verse 15, former governors did. I never did. And not only that, in verse 18, he says, this is what I prepared every day. And I've got a list here of what verse 18 is all about. This is what he said he provided every day for his staff out of his own pocket. An ox, $1,250. A sheep, $300 each, 6 of them. 20 chickens, I'm guessing $10 each. Maybe Costco. You could have got them cheaper at Costco, but Costco wasn't around then. 50 wines, $500 perhaps. that daily cost is $3,750. He's investing every day in his staff, out of his own pocket, $3,750, or $1.3 million a year. But he said he was there for 12 years. He never charged anyone anything, and he provided this every day for 12 years. So the total cost over 12 years to Nehemiah to build the wall, $16.4 million. It's pretty staggering, isn't it? I mean, when you look at, I know Brother Max is smiling because he's the finance brother for the Ecclesia, so he's hoping for an increase next week in the EFTs that come in. I find this just staggering that Nehemiah isn't directing people, build the wall, and he's charging people, he's making money out of this. He put $16.4 million into his people, into his nation, into his ecclesia, so that he could pull them all together and they'd be ready for the kingdom to be established. It's an amazing figure, and of course that doesn't include everything else. That's just the food there. What about all the servants' wages and everything else? So he paid for the building of the wall out of his own salary, and he hoped that example would be taken up by others as well. And of course, right through the New Testament, we've got the Apostle Paul, who talks about that, contributing to the necessity of the saints, given to hospitality. Remember in Acts chapter 20, he talks about he worked with his own hands, not only to pay his own way, but to pay the brothers that were on mission work with him. And so the ecclesia didn't have to charge him anything. So he could go anywhere and he wasn't going to impress people with what they owed him. Talked about that in 2 Thessalonians as well. We did this because we don't want to be chargeable to any of you. This is our investment in you and in the truth. And John talks about the spirit of generosity as well. So, you know, that's an important thing that Nehemiah established. And Paul in Corinthians talks about, particularly in chapter 8, the generosity of the Philippian ecclesia to the Macedonian ecclesia to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Remember, the Apostle Paul was taking up a collection, and he just talks about them going through hard times. They actually took a loan so they could give extra money to Paul to take back to the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. So the spirit of Nehemiah was also seen in the work of the Apostle Paul. And it can be seen in us as well. And I know, you know, from a financial viewpoint of our ecclesia, the EFT contributions that were brought in COVID were very, very helpful, because previously to that was sort of random spare change we had in our pockets. But doing an EFT, we commit, and there's a consistency there, which is our theme for tonight, and that's very, very good and very, very helpful. So we budget our life based upon, well, what can we do to help in the truth? So that was one problem solved in chapter 5, but we want to have a look briefly at chapter 6 as well, because, well, here's another layer of problems that's going to happen. And now the surrounding tribes are going to get physically agitated, and they're going to make threats, and not only will it be the foreign tribes, it'll be internal brethren and prophets and priests that are now putting pressure on Nehemiah to back off and to finish and not complete the project, to walk away from it. So there's a plot to kidnap him. There's a plot to malign him. There's letters being sent around to intimidate. There's actual threats being made against his life, and a plot to undermine him as well from quite a few levels. So we'll notice in chapter 6 and verse 1, this plot to distract and kidnap him. It's fake friendship. They're all making out to be buddies, Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem. When they heard that I builded the wall and the breaches were being closed, he notes he hasn't got the doors and the gates. They were always important. Remember back to our previous studies. Verse 2 says, let's come to the village of the plain of Ono. Oh no. And I remember Uncle John Martin, when he studied, he said the reply was sent back, oh no, I'm not going to Ono. So they were trying to distract Nehemiah from the work that he was doing. And they invited him to the plain of Ono. Now, where is that? 50 kilometres west of Jerusalem, near Joppa. So geographically, it's not a close location. It's 50 kilometres west of Jerusalem near Joppa. So the point of that village, or the plain, is that it's a long way from the work. So they wanted to distract Nehemiah from his work. Would have taken a long day to get there, conference there, travel back, weeks gone. And the plan was, by Sanballat and his mates, was to get him away from Jerusalem. He'd have an accident or a tragedy and they'd send news back, sorry, Nehemiah, was eaten by a lion or something similar. So that was their plan there. And in fact, you'll notice in verse 4, they're very persistent. It says, 4 times they sent me the same message. 4 times they sent that to me. I've got here Psalm 55 verse 21. This is the interaction between David and Ahithophel, his wise counsellor. It says there, the words of his mouth were smoother than butter. Smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. And then he says, cast thy burden upon Yahweh and he will sustain thee. Psalm 55 verse 21. Similar situation here. All these smooth words come, we want to have a conference, we'll have it down the plain of Ono. And you know what, if Nehemiah had a mobile phone, I reckon he would have sent a smiley face and said, I'm doing a great work, I can't come. See verse 3? He sent messages saying, I'm doing a great work. So I reckon that'd be the text, and it'd have a smiley face, and he got on with his work. So he wasn't, distracted at all. So that's the focus that he had. Well, they're going to be persistent because in verse 5 to 9, there's now another plot that emerges. The pressure gets deeper. And you'll notice in verse 5, it comes now for the 5th time. So then sent Sanballat his servant to me in like manner, the 5th time. But did you notice there's a difference? With an open letter in his hand. Now what's that mean? Open letter? Well, normally official letters of communication were rolled up in a parchment and sealed, all right, or tied with a string, sealed with clay or wax. Private communication, highly sensitive, no one else needs to read it. But this one here is a parchment that's open, so it meant that everyone that passed it on as they're travelling down through to Nehemiah, all the way from Sanballat's headquarters, everyone was reading it as they're going along. It would have been an affront to Nehemiah because remember, he's the king's representative and he's been trained in Persian protocol. So he understands sensitive communication and how it should be delivered. And he notices this lack of formality. It's just an open letter. Everybody's reading it as they're passing it round. And it's like an insult to Nehemiah. It's like an intimidation. It's a bit of contempt, like, here's an open letter. Nowadays, I guess it's like Facebook or something, I guess, just gets rolled up onto the internet and everybody sees it. So it's a little bit like that. And you'll notice what's in the letter, which they all read. In fact, verse 6 and 7, I've got the word thou coloured in because, well, it's the word you. You came to Jerusalem, you set yourself up as king, you didn't disclose your motives, you've got a secret agenda. We're sending back to King Artaxerxes that you want to be king, is essentially what that letter said. And so they're undermining Nehemiah and they're attributing to him wrong motives, and everybody knows about it because everybody's read the letter. Rumours are going about and, talk's happening. In fact, what they've said there in verse 7 is that you've anointed or appointed prophets to preach of you at Jerusalem, saying there's a king in Judah. So they're quoting Zechariah's prophecies given back in Zechariah 9 and verse 9, which was 80, 90 years before. And they're quoting Zechariah's prophecies and saying, you attributing those prophecies to yourself. And Zechariah 9 verse 9 says, behold, your king comes onto you riding on a donkey. He's lowly, promising salvation. Remember, Nehemiah got on a donkey and rode around the walls of Jerusalem at night time in the previous chapter. So they're claiming that Nehemiah attributed kingship to himself. He wants to be king and he's appointing all these prophets. So you can imagine the public outrage if that motive was attributed to Nehemiah. You can imagine what people would be saying in Jerusalem about Nehemiah. We never knew that he wanted to be a king. So, this is the innuendo that they were sending, streaming through, trying to unsettle this whole project. And you'll notice in verse 9, and it just simply says, and I'm saying Nehemiah is a man of wonderful emotion, angry in the previous chapter, afraid in this one. All right, so he's human, and 4 times in this chapter, in verse 9, verse 13, verse 14, and verse 19, he says, I took these physical threats seriously. Nehemiah just didn't say, look, we've got the wall, fellas. I've prayed to God a couple of times. Let's just keep on going. Again, wasn't mechanical in just his approach to life. He says, we were literally afraid. This is real. This is real. This is happening to us. I take their threats seriously. And it includes in verse 9, they made us afraid. So there seems to be some friendships around, or some brethren, sisters maybe, who were friendly with Nehemiah, who supported him in his work, and who helped him through this situation as well. So Nehemiah just was aware of what was going on, but of course he wanted to continue to build that wall, that project that he had. So he didn't try to assert his innocence. He didn't write a letter back. He didn't demand that be withdrawn. In today's world, when we get those emails going backwards and forwards, or maybe it's SMS, trying to justify our position, Nehemiah didn't do any of that. He just simply got on with the work. And I think this little statement here is quite powerful, and it talks about, what values do we have in our own life? No person can lead a spiritual life if they allow themselves to be governed by what other people think. Yes, they should seek help, fellowship, prayer and advice, but only if their ultimate decisions are based on, but if their ultimate decisions are based on popular opinion, they're going to fail. So, we've got to weigh up, and people give us plenty of advice, and maybe we'll want to run with the herd and everybody's saying we need to do this. But Nehemiah basically brings it back to the core centre point. Is it God's will? Is this right in the sight of God? So we're not creating our spiritual lives based on popular opinion or what society thinks. We're basing it on the Word of God and what we know is right in the sight of God. And that's how Nehemiah handled it. Look at the end of verse 9. They made us afraid, saying their hands are going to be weakened. What does he do? Does he run with popular opinion? No. He prays to his God. In the same verse, compressed in that same verse, now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. So he found his strength in prayer and in Scripture. He didn't run around trying to figure out what was being said, and gossip is certainly, and slander is certainly hurtful, but he didn't waste a lot of time on that. He just went to God in prayer and asked for God's help to continue the work. Now, you might like to put in your margin, 2 Kings 19 verse 14. Same thing happened to Hezekiah. 2 Kings 19 verse 14 says, Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. It's from Sennacherib. And Sennacherib was challenging the God of Hezekiah, saying, what God are you worshipping? I've steamrolled through all these nations, and their gods were nothing. And the record goes on, and Hezekiah went up into the house of Yahweh, and he opened it up, he spread it before his God. 2 Kings 19 verse 14. So Hezekiah did exactly what later on Nehemiah did as well. He just took it to God in prayer. And that's how we need to deal with those situations in life. And again, Psalmist talks about, I've heard the slander of many. Fear was on every side, very similar to Nehemiah. They took counsel together against me. They desired to take away my life, but I trusted in thee. Jeremiah, exactly the same thing. Slander, innuendo. But, these faithful men just connected themselves to their God and worked through this situation. So there was a lot of slander, a lot of innuendo as far as Nehemiah was concerned by his enemies, the tribes around who were trying to really dissolve this wall. But more than that, they were trying to dissolve the unity of the people, to break them down from the values that they held. And so we say a spiritually minded person is one who can lay a firm foundation with the bricks that others throw at him. And that's what Nehemiah was doing. He's building a wall. There's a lot of criticism happening. He takes that on board and he continues to build the wall. Well, we notice thirdly in verses 10 to 14, there's another plot, but now it becomes internal, because you'll notice there in verse 10, there's a man called, well, it says, after they came to the house, quite prestigious, Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Metabeel. So he's a man of prestige. There's 3 generations. He actually claimed to be a prophet. When you look at verse 12 and verse 14, Nehemiah says, I perceived God hadn't sent him. But even in that little name sequence in verse 10, here's what those names mean. Shemaiah means heard of Yahweh. Delaiah means freed by Yahweh. Mehetabeel means favoured of Ale. So heard, freed and favoured of God, like that's a big compression there. And here's a man who professed to be a man of God. Heard of Yahweh, freed of Yahweh, favoured of Yahweh. Here's a man that claimed to be a man of God. And look what he says in verse 10. Let's hide ourselves in the temple. He was pretending that he was also afraid of Nehemiah's opponents. And he said, come on, let's go into the temple. We'll be safe there. We'll lock the doors in the temple. And as a demonstration of that, he was shutting his house in verse 10 as though, it was an impending invasion. What did Nehemiah say? Verse 11, he says, should such a man as I flee and leave others to face death? Do you think I'm going to just run to the house of God and protect myself and leave my brothers and my sisters open to invasion? So again, great example by Nehemiah. And there were a couple of things that worried Nehemiah by that suggestion of this man who claimed he was a man of God. Verse 13, he says, therefore he was hired that I should be afraid and do so and sin. He was afraid of offending God. He wasn't going to go and burst into the temple and lock himself there, because that was a sin against God. He wasn't a priest. Nehemiah was not a priest at all. And the misuse of the temple would have violated the temple's prohibitions. The high priest only could go in the Holy of Holies, and only priests into the Most Holy. Nehemiah knew his Bible, and he said, I'm not going to go into the temple. I remember there was a king earlier on who went into the temple, and he had that cancer come out on his forehead, Uzziah, in 2 Chronicles 26, verse 16 to 20. It says there, Uzziah transgressed against Yahweh his God and went into the temple to burn incense. And those 80 priests came out and they faced him off and said, you're the king. You are not authorised to go in here. You are not a priest. This is prohibited area. And now this so-called man of God, this prophet, was saying to Nehemiah, hey, why don't we go in the temple and lock ourselves in there? So Nehemiah knew that was wrong. Again, if you're taking notes, Numbers 3 verse 10 says, you will appoint Aaron and his sons, and they will wait on the priest's office, and the stranger that comes nigh shall be put to death. If someone tries to make entrance into the temple area, you will put them to death. So all I'm saying is, number one, Nehemiah knew it was a sin against his God. He knew his Bible. And that's why we're here tonight, isn't it? Because if we know our Bible, if we know the values and the principles, it'll help us from making a disastrous mistake. And the second thing is, as he says in verse 13, he wanted to be a good example to people, both in word and deed. And so at the end of verse 13, it says that they might have this matter for an evil report, and it would be a reproach to us. So he wanted to be a good example as well in everything that he did. Well, we find in verse 14, unbelievable. Shemaiah was not the only prophet. You'll notice in verse 14, there's more. The prophetess Noadiah and other prophets trying to manipulate Nehemiah. Just incredible that these pseudo-prophets were trying to manipulate Nehemiah to make a mistake. And what's his reply? Well, his reply is in verse 14, my God, think upon that. He's a man of prayer and action as well. So these are false prophets. So you can see all the levels that Nehemiah is having to deal with. So many pressures. And even brothers and sisters, in quotes, saying to him, hey, you better get to the temple because that's the only safe place. And I'm a prophet of God, so, trust me. And so Ezekiel chapter 13, pretty well the whole of Ezekiel chapter 13 talks about false prophets and the disaster that they would bring and how carefully we have to listen to them. And this is interesting, some of the terminology it talks about are very similar to the building of the wall. You have not gone up to the breaks in the wall to repair it. That was the job of the prophets, was to protect the people. Say peace, peace, when there's no peace. When a flimsy wall is built, they cover it with whitewash. So the prophet Ezekiel was talking about all these false prophets, and the wrong message was just whitewashing all the problems and not dealing with them. And that's exactly what's happening here with Nehemiah. And then fourthly, in verse 15 to 19, you'll notice there's a plot to undermine him further. Verse 17 says, there were many letters to Tobiah. So this is internally now. There's a lot of communication going on from the Jews in Jerusalem, and they're sending letters keeping Tobiah informed. Now that's particularly sad in verse 17. The nobles of Judah, I'm guessing this is like the arranging brethren. The arranging brethren in the ecclesia were sending and communicating and encouraging Tobiah. I've got across in my margin Proverbs 6, verse 16 to 19. And it says, God hates 7 things: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked imaginations, feet that are swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaks lies, and he that sows discord amongst brethren. Proverbs 6, verse 16 to 19, it's exactly what these prophets were doing. They were sowing discord amongst their brothers and sisters. And you can see what the problem is now for Nehemiah and for the people, the good people. It was virtually impossible to distinguish who was the enemy, because the enemy had infiltrated the walls of Jerusalem with these letters. So everything that Nehemiah was trying to build, a defence of the truth, had been undermined, and now the prophets, the nobles, many of the people were encouraging the enemy to come within. And you'll notice in verse 18, it says there, and this is Nehemiah's diary entry, there were many in Judah sworn to him. The ESV says bound by an oath. New English translation said had sworn allegiance. And that word sworn in the Hebrew, Baal Shebua, means Lord, Master, or husband of the promise. They basically got a bond or an oath with these enemy tribes around. So there was a strategy of infiltration that was going on there. And sadly, it talks about the relationship that they had, verse 18. He was the son-in-law. He was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah. And his son, Johanan, had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. So Tobiah's brother-in-law, Shemaiah, the son of Shechaniah, was, in chapter 3, verse 29, interestingly, the keeper of the east gate. Right, he repaired the east gate. So that's Tobiah's brother-in-law, and that's how Tobiah smuggled these letters in through the east gate, we could say. This man was accepting those letters. So what's Nehemiah going to do? Layer after layer after layer of problems and issues. Well, you know what? He just writes in his diary in verse 15, I think this is fantastic. So the wall was built in 52 days. That's 1/7 of a year, apparently. So interesting time period, 52 days. But what encouragement for Nehemiah with all of this troublous times going on. In fact, Daniel 9 verse 25 says, the wall will be built in troublous times. It's a fulfilment of Daniel's prophecy there in chapter 9 and verse 25. So for Nehemiah, I stand back with incredible respect for this man. I'm going to list 16 problems that he faced. He faced despair. He faced depression. I remember he prayed for about 4 months because he was worried about the city of Jerusalem. When he came, there's apathy. For 90 years, the walls had just sort of lain there and everyone was happy with all this broken rubble around the walls. They didn't care less. He faced derision. All the tribes laughed at Nehemiah when he came all the way from Persia as if he's going to change anything. It's been like this for 90 years. Contempt, they ridiculed him. Remember, Tobiah said, look at it, fox brushes against the wall, the whole thing will fall over. He faced open opposition, discouragement, sabotage, ecclesial disharmony. We're talking about that tonight. False friendship. He continued to face scandal as his letters went about, death threats, betrayal, utter disloyalty. And you know what? We're not going to get to chapter 13, but the reality is when he went away, he went back after 12 years, went back to Persia to report to the king. And when he came back again after 13 years, everything was undone. But so wonderfully, of course, he finished, his record with saying to and praying to God to remember for the good that he'd done. Well, what was interesting about this when we do the calculation, the walls are finished right here, which was in fact 5 days from the Feast of Trumpets. So the walls are finished here, and then 5 days later is the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Very significant time in Israel's calendar. And against this little comment in verse 15, the wall was finished, you might like to put John 19 verse 30. It's the statement of the Lord Jesus Christ on the cross. It is finished. And I almost think like the way that Nehemiah wrote that little comment, the walls were finished, was like the accomplishment of the Lord Jesus Christ, who of course finished the ministry in John 19 and verse 30 and was to go to the next phase. So, the wall was finished. Amazing 52 days, amazing person to be able to do that. And we've got the question, why hadn't the job been done for 90 years? Why hadn't anyone bothered? Well, because it took someone with a good example and a good spirit. He had the difficulties, but he also had consistency and perseverance. And it's the same God, brothers and sisters, that Nehemiah that works in our lives. And I tend to think we look at all these stories and think, wow, what a great man, what a great story. And then we trudge off into our lives and think, well, I've got to face a lot of problems, so I'm sort of disconnected from this. But we're not. It's the same God that worked in the life of Nehemiah that works in our lives as well and uses us as tools to accomplish his purpose. So it's quite amazing that Nehemiah actually spent more time in prayer, 4 months in prayer, back in Shushan, but only 2 months to complete the work. And I think for us, I've got a little comment here, often the mental struggle takes longer than solving the actual problem. And that's where we are. We struggle with sometimes our decisions or where we're going in life. And hopefully one day for us, it will be finished. So for Nehemiah, of course, his focus, and I'm just going to whip through this quickly, his focus was always right through his diary was on his God. Got so many quotations. He leaned upon God as we do as well. So what's some of the lessons for us? Nehemiah ignited in different brothers and sisters and taught them to appreciate communal strength. So, coming together as an ecclesia helps us. There's support, there's encouragement, and we can take stronger steps of commitment because of the brothers and sisters that are around us. We can help rebuild our own defences and reinvigorate others if we have a heart for God's work. We can do it. We can do it in 52 days. We can change the direction we're going in 52 days if we want to, because Nehemiah proves that. It's been done before, trying circumstances by average people prepared to pick up tools and make the joy of Yahweh their strength. So what have we learnt? When pressure is intense, do we take the time to pause and consult with ourselves and rebalance it? We're so thankful Sunday morning we can do that and step back. Do we have the courage to confront our sins, specifically identify, immediately correct, nominate someone to help, seriously commit to God? Nehemiah gave 16.4 million out of his personal savings because he believed in God's work. Do we contribute? What does it cost us? What does the truth cost us? Have we ever been unfairly criticised or heard a rumour about ourselves that was untrue? Did we keep working the great work, or did we say, if people are going to think that about me, I'm not going to be involved? And finally, could we patch up a broken life and rebuild it in 52 days? Maybe it'd be our life, maybe the life of someone else. But we can do it because that's what Nehemiah achieved. And what a sense of confidence he had when he said, it's finished. And brothers and sisters, we aren't finished yet. God is still working with us. So let's place our faith and trust in him.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.